Welcome, and thank you for joining us at Learning Beyond Tomorrow, the Education Leadership Forum by Oxford University Press, China. And today we have a really huge honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Heath Rose. He's one of our very own scholars from Oxford University, and as we may know, Oxford University Press is part of the University of Oxford. And what we do is to further the objective and the mission of the university in advancing learning and knowledge. So we are so grateful today to have Professor Heath Rose, who is the Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics from the Department of Education of Oxford. He leads and teaches courses on teaching English language in university settings and applied linguistics for language teaching. And after starting his career in schools in Australia and Japan, he eventually moved to higher education and joined the Oxford University. Professor Rose's interests are in the fields of second language teaching, language learner strategies, global Englishes, teaching English as an international language, and English medium instruction. And today, he'll be giving us insights on the topic of teaching English and teaching English in the 21st century, globalization, and English language teaching. So without further delay, please welcome Professor Heath Rose.
Great. So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak at the conference on a topic that I'm quite passionate about. And so this actually brings together two of my interests, one being global Englishes and the other being English medium instruction. And so today I have broken my talk up into three distinct parts. So I'm going to first talk about the global growth of English, and so what's been happening with English around the world in the especially the recent decades. Then I'm going to look at the implications that this has for global approaches to language teaching. So what should language teaching look like in the 21st century in response to the growth of English as a global language? And then I'm going to look at, for the final part of my talk, I'll look at English medium instruction, which looks at recent movements in some parts of the world to switch subject matter, so start teaching school subjects through the medium of English and the kinds of challenges that this entails. And so the first part, I just briefly want to go over the global growth of English. And so for this graph that I'm going to show you, I'm drawing on some statistics from David Graddle and his colleagues, who crunched numbers to try to predict what the growth of English language users might look like over a 100-year period. And so he tracked it from the 1950 to 2050. And what we can see over this time, we see growth in major languages around the world. So here we are about now in 2021. So we can see languages like Arabic are growing quite rapidly, languages such as French as well, Spanish, and as well as speakers of English as a native or first language. We also see massive languages like Mandarin Chinese here, which are almost, the growth is moving beyond the chart. So when we look at first language speakers of English, there seems to be nothing quite distinct or unique about it, particularly in comparison to other languages such as Chinese. And this is because the growth of English isn't being driven by native or first language speakers. It's by those who speak English as a second, foreign, or lingua franca language. And in order to capture them on the graph, we need to shrink, the scale a little bit. And if we look at all users of English, so they're those that speak English as a first language, a second language, a foreign language, lingua franca language, the graph looks something like this. And so if we see where we are now at the end of 2021, we can see that actually the rapid growth of English has only really just begun. And it's due to a lot of the educational policies that we're seeing today or in the last decade that are really going to produce massive numbers of English language speakers in the near future. So while it's difficult to predict the number of English speakers around the world, and it's very difficult to estimate, these numbers have been widely used, roughly between 320 and 380 million speakers of English as a native language, between 300 and 500 million speakers of English as a second language, especially in nations where it has an official status, and then more than 1 billion speakers of English as a foreign language. Some other recent guesses have put this figure at 1.5 billion, but it's very difficult actually to draw the line between when do you judge a learner of English as being a speaker of English. But what is clear, regardless of these numbers, is that there are now more non-native speakers of English than native speakers. And this much is very clear no matter what type of statistic you draw upon. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to discuss the implications of this massive growth. But before I do that, I just want to point out that, of course, this growth of English hasn't come without some negative consequences. And so it's important to acknowledge those before we move forward to look at the implications. So it has consequences actually in English-speaking countries where we have seen huge drops in university applications for languages. And this is particularly prevalent in places like the UK and Australia, which used to really push modern foreign language education. And now, less emphasis is being put on it because students wrongly believe that, being a native speaker of English will be enough for their global competitive advantage. What we're finding actually is this is not true, as many businesses are looking for multilingual graduates. Also in places like the EU, which used to promote a lot of language learning of its neighbors, and an EU policy to teach at least 2 foreign languages to all European Union students, what we're finding actually is that fewer EU pupils are actually being taught 2 foreign languages in the classroom. And so when they are taught a foreign language, it's often only English. And so we can see this by this graph looking at 28 nations in the EU, excluding the Anglophone countries, that actually 96% of European Union students now are studying English as their first and primary language. And so when other languages are studied, such as French or Spanish, it's to a much lesser extent than it was before. So then looking then at the growth of English and looking at what implications this might have for English language teaching, I'm going to draw on some scholars here, particularly actually voices that have come from the Hong Kong and Asian region. So Kirkpatrick, who did a lot of his work in the Hong Kong region, had noted very early on that this growth of English has implications for language learning goals, for language teachers, and for the curriculum. Matsuda and Friedrich say the linguistic, cultural, and functional diversity associated with English today challenges some of the fundamental assumptions of English language teaching and requires that we revisit our pedagogical practices. So what these scholars are saying is that the way that we approach teaching of English in the 21st century needs to change, needs to be much more aware that actually the students are going into a global community of English language users, which might have been very different to how English language curricula were developed 40 years ago, maybe where English was more positioned as a modern foreign language for students to learn. There are a number of terms that have been used to capture this growth. So some people refer to it as English as a lingua franca. So this is a lingua franca, meaning a language of communication between speakers of 2 different languages. Some people refer to it as English as an international language. So in a lot of my work, I refer to it as global Englishes. And so the emphasis is on pluralizing Englishes instead of English, to acknowledge that lots of different varieties of English exist, and the way that English is used globally around the world is really diverse. And we've seen recently quite a lot of rich research come out of global Englishes, particularly in the Asian context. And so I'm drawing attention to a book here, which includes a lot of Asian scholarship. A lot of my work in global Englishes also came out of work in contexts such as Japan and more recently China. So what global Englishes then argues is that things need to change in English language teaching. And so what I want to talk to you today is about 6 major proposals for change that we see should happen in English language teaching to meet the needs of students. And so the first of these is to increase exposure to English varieties in English language classrooms today. So what we can see is that when we look at languages, when we look at a language, when it's in contact with other languages and speakers, we know that language changes. And so if we just look at this historical depiction of English over 1,000 years, we can see that English 1,000 years ago is almost unrecognizable to English today, particularly not compared even to the 1900s. And this is because when languages move, when they're in contact with other speakers, when they're in contact with other languages, they change. And so a lot of English changed due to contact with languages such as Latin or French in this earlier period, and then in later periods when it spread through British colonialism. And so what happens now then that English is a global language spoken by 1 billion people? It's a language that has been in contact with more speakers and more languages than any other language in history. And so obviously this has an impact on the diverse types of English, accents, dialects, varieties of English that we see today. And we can see this even in places such as the UK. And there are problems with approaches to English language teaching that only represent a single standard variety of English. So in many texts and audio materials, for example, they'll use British English, a type of British English called received pronunciation. So here referred to as RP. And so even though RP is the standard English taught in a lot of textbooks and school curricula, it's actually only spoken by about 3 to 6% of the UK population. So even if you go to the UK, you won't encounter a majority of speakers of this variety. General American is often also used, but it's not a single standard. And what we see now that English has become a global language is that students need English for global usage, not merely for communication with native speakers of these standards. So Saraceni said in 2019, to support the notion of standard English is incompatible with the complex reality of how English is used worldwide. And so here we can even see in a place like the UK, which is, often, we have this ideal that this is the home of standard language. We can see that, according to these colors, a lot of different dialects exist. So a global English's approach argues that diverse exposure to a diversity of English is essential. To be able to communicate successfully with people all over the globe, students need to comprehend different varieties so that they are better prepared to deal with interactions in international contexts. And so it might be up to teachers to identify in different contexts which varieties might be more important to their students. So for example, for many years, I worked in a business school at a Japanese university, and it soon became apparent, actually, that these Japanese graduates were more likely to do business in their future careers with people from China, Korea, and India, Singapore, rather than people from, business colleagues from America and the UK. And so then we felt that it was our duty in their preparation of English language classes to expose them to those varieties of English so that they could become accustomed to using them after graduation. A second proposal for change, and I'm going to talk about these two together, is emphasizing more respect for multilingualism and emphasizing respect for diverse English-using cultures and communities. And so really this is pushing the notion that actually multilingualism is the norm of the future, that actually with the majority of students speaking English being as a second or foreign language, they're bringing with them other languages. And actually a lot of conversations, a lot of communication in a global world today is done in more than one language. And so for that, then we need to respect multilingualism as the norm, and respect diverse English-using cultures and communities. So when we look at textbooks from about 40 years ago, we can see popular pages like this that really depict this idea that students are learning English to learn about Britain or to learn about American culture. And with this is this communication of this idea to students that they're learning English to use in Britain with British people or in America with American people. We also see segments of textbooks such as this that really point to the idea of real English. So this idea that the real English is spoken in the UK. And so a global Englishes approach would be seen to move away from this and to argue that actually these days an English using culture could exist in China, it could exist in Japan, it could exist in a company in Germany. And these are all legitimate English using contexts, and that it's not just these kind of static cultures of America and Britain or Australia, which we are portraying to students as places where English exists, that actually English exists now all around us. And actually, for many students, they may go on to use English, in a majority local context. So with this also is a need to raise awareness of global Englishes. So students are aware of how they're going to use English in the future, how it is used today. So Global Englishes argues for a need to directly teach issues surrounding, the growth of English. So we can teach issues surrounding global usage so that they understand how English is used today. Issues of ownership, we can challenge the ideas of who owns English. Is a Hong Kong speaker of English any less legitimate than an Australian speaker of English? Global Englishes would say no. And maybe also engage students in debate over standard language and their own attitudes towards what they believe is a standard or desirable language. Because research has shown that awareness can increase students' confidence and self-perception as multilingual users of English. A good example of this was a study done by Nicola Galloway with her students in Japan, where she got her students to debate and discuss the legitimacy of Singaporean English. And so for this task, they researched a lot about the debates in Singapore around standard English versus Singaporean English, and engaged in debates and discussion. And so what she found was that these Japanese students having this debate around Singaporean English had really positive effects on their own reflections of themselves as Japanese users of English. And, this being a legitimate identity, and Japanese English also being a legitimate variety. So we also see a need to raise awareness of ELF strategies. And so when I say ELF, I'm talking about English as a lingua franca. So often in English language teaching, we do teach communication strategies. We teach students, for example, to clarify something, to say, I'm sorry, what do you mean by that? Or to repeat something, to say, I'm sorry, could you say that again? But a lot of this is really contextualized around being understood by a native speaker. So the problem with communicating is always depicted as being the students, not the person they're communicating with, who is often depicted as the native speaker. So they're the ones asking for clarity, asking for repetition. But Global Englishes sees a need for a wider number of strategies because students are going to encounter a wide range of students when they're using English in the 21st century. So students might have to speak to other speakers of English of a greater or lower proficiency than themselves, and they need to have the strategies of what to do even when they are trying to communicate with somebody with lower proficiency. And so how are they able to adapt their language to help communication in that way? How are they able to have the strategies to adapt to different accents or accents that they find difficult to understand? How will they adapt when they enter new communities that might have different ways of doing things or ways of using language? And so we see this as being an important element. Finally, Global English's approach to language teaching sees that we need a change in teacher hiring practices. So what we often see around the world, particularly in the commercial area of English language teaching, is that native English speakers are desired. So from Poland, where people are advertising for a native speaker of English, to China, to Japan, we see this desire for native speakers with native dialects. So what this means, actually, considering that 80% of teachers around the world are non-native English-speaking teachers, is that on a global level, the ELT profession is perhaps the world's only occupation in which the majority faces discrimination. So sometimes it's explicit in these ads, sometimes it's more implicit and hidden. So here's a foreign language school in Japan that is advertising teachers. It doesn't necessarily say you have to be a native speaker, but when we go to apply, we find that we can only apply in Canada, US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So this is communicating something quite powerful to applicants, that only teachers from these regions are desirable. And so we can see it also in job ads. So this was a study by Mahbub and Golden in 2013, looking at discrimination in English language teaching job advertisements. And they found that nativeness, so being a native speaker, was the biggest criteria where discrimination occurred. So the 21st century, then, to combat this, really, we see a need to change English language teaching hiring practices. We argue for a need of hiring based on qualifications and to re-examine the concept of qualified teachers. So Kirkpatrick has argued that actually expert users, so these are teachers that have learnt English themselves and mastered English themselves, are much better role models for students than native English speakers who might, represent an identity of English use that many learners will never be able to achieve and shouldn't have to achieve to be functioning as global users of the language. So he really calls on the need or importance of multilingual English teachers to be the most appropriate role models for students. We also see a need, I see a real authenticity that's added when we have a non-native English-speaking teacher that speaks a different first language than their students. So for example, if you have a teacher from the Philippines or a teacher from Thailand working in Japan or China, there's automatically an authenticity that they bring to the classroom that for students and the teacher, English automatically becomes the lingua franca language. And this can really promote really positive, authentic uses of the language in the classroom because they have to communicate in English as their lingua franca language to conduct classes. So there are 6 proposals for change for teaching English in the 21st century. Of course, there are some barriers to this change that need to be acknowledged. So first of all, we currently see a lack of materials, although a lot of publishing houses like OUP Press, Oxford University Press, and other presses around the world are trying to combat this, and they're integrating more and more global content, more and more variation in Englishes and accents and types of speakers into their materials. But in the future, I think we need to see a lot more of this, these materials to make a global approach to English language teaching possible. Language assessment is, of course, a big barrier. And, if standard language tests such as IELTS and TOEFL, remain as they do, they'll often have some kind of effect on teaching in the curriculum. Teacher education and training can be a barrier that actually many teachers, might need retraining to adapt to new approaches of English language teaching. We also have attachments to standards. So many parents, many students actually desire a standard English. Global English says this isn't wrong. If students desire it, they want to speak like an American, like a British person, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. but they should be aware that this isn't necessarily the only English that they will encounter and use in the future. And then I've discussed before, teacher recruitment practices are a barrier. As long as commercial industries really push this idea that the native English speaker is best, it will be very difficult to change practices. So that concludes the second part of the talk. For the final part of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about teaching in English. So far we've talked about teaching English. Now I want to talk about teaching in English in the 21st century, which I will refer to as English Medium Instruction, or EMI. So EMI has a number of definitions. The one I prefer is this one. It's the use of English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. So basically, this means teaching of subjects such as science or physics or history in the medium of English in countries where English is not the majority language. So in countries, for example, such as China. And so what we've seen now is a lot of schools are moving towards English medium instruction, that the curriculum has shifted from focusing on teaching language to focusing on teaching content. Somewhere in the middle, we find something called CLIL, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning. And this is very popular, especially in the school context. So Hong Kong is a great context, a good example where CLIL has been happening for a number of decades, where there is both a focus on content and language. So maybe some school subjects are taught in English, but there's also a focus on developing the English language skills of students as well. So, students continue to also take English as a language. And what we've seen around the world is a real growth in English medium instruction, or CLIL. A lot of this growth has stemmed from the real explosion of academic English. And so we can see in terms of academic publishing, from the latter half of last century, English has really come to monopolize academic publishing. And so this means that a lot of research these days, a lot of research knowledge, a lot of new findings are only written in English. And for universities to have access to that knowledge, often, there is a greater emphasis on the role of English to access that. What we've then also seen is the internationalization of higher education and universities. And so this means that as universities try to compete globally, they're trying to attract international students. And so, for example, in Europe, where this has been going on for a number of decades, there's been a 50 times growth in English medium instruction at undergraduate programs in Europe in 8 years, from 55 programs to 2,900 programs. And a lot of this growth stems from this idea to attract students from other countries. And so it soon became apparent with mobility programs for students in Europe that if a German university wanted to attract students from, say, Italy or France, they couldn't expect students to study advanced physics in German. But there was this understanding that a lot of European students learn English. And so they started to switch a lot of the degrees taught through the medium of English. And so that's really driven this growth. In China and Japan, we've seen huge policy reforms that have encouraged EMI at universities as well. So EMI is a galloping phenomenon, and it's now, Chappell says it's considered the most significant trend in educational internationalization. We're starting to see it, globally in most countries around the world. So what I'm going to do is just look a little bit about what some of the research has said about CLIL. because I think CLIL is quite relevant to the Hong Kong context, particularly, and the school context, because rather than English medium instruction, which is often at universities where everything is entirely taught in English, CLIL often has some kind of language support or language benefits, and happens a lot in schools. And so CLIL has often been promoted as a way to benefit students to improve their language learning, but not affect negatively their learning of other subjects. So recently, some colleagues and mine, so my colleague Victoria Murphy and a group at our university, wanted to look at what is the evidence actually that CLIL is doing its job. You know, is it really improving students' language learning content and subject learning? What we concluded by looking at a lot of evidence from a wide range of studies is that CLIL actually does seem to have some beneficial effects on language learning. But a lot of this evidence comes from students who may be more motivated or have initial advantages. So often where we see CLIL happening might be in schools, that might be in communities where parents will be more interested in education and maybe push and support education more. CLIL students seem to benefit in overall proficiency across the 4 skills, but mostly in speaking and vocabulary. So it seems to have some positive benefits there. But our review also found that weak forms of CLIL, so that is in schools that maybe only teach 1 or 2 subjects in the second language, so 1 or 2 subjects in English and say the rest in Cantonese, that actually this model is no better than just teaching traditional English as a foreign language subjects. And so in the case of CLIL, actually a school needs to invest in more than 1 or 2 subjects. How about subject learning? So we also looked at this, and we did find some positive results that most students did not seem to experience negative effects in the long term. So with the emphasis of in the long term. So, you know, I think a lot of studies have shown it can be very difficult for students to adjust to learning subjects in English, but in the long term, they seem to recover. However, we did find evidence from research that CLIL may benefit motivated or gifted students more because they're motivated by studying in English. And that CLIL may have detrimental effects on low academic performers. So that is students that are not going to do so well academically might actually be better off learning in their first language, or I shouldn't say might, they are better off learning in their first language. So in this way, then we have to be quite cautious with CLIL because it might widen the gap in educational outcomes. So those motivated or gifted students are going to do better and better through CLIL, and those that struggle to academically perform might do worse. And so the gap between them might be widened due to CLIL approaches without the right language support. In other reviews my groups conducted, we've also see that there are a number of challenges also at EMI at university. And so these include detrimental effects on subject learning, a longer time to complete courses. A lot of studies have pointed that students lack the vocabulary to study advanced topics in English. They might have problems communicating disciplinary content. So they might be able to read it and understand it or listen to a lecture, but they have trouble communicating that content. Classes are less interactive, where students ask and answer fewer questions. Other issues are that students are being admitted with different levels of English proficiency, which can be quite difficult for teachers to encounter. Proficiency might not be high enough to ensure success. The types of challenges depend on the high school medium of instruction and the discipline of study. And all of this points to the fact that actually we need more language support to ensure success of EMI, both in schools and universities. And so this returns back to the importance of English language teaching, that we can't automatically switch the content and just think students are just going to naturally pick up the language, that actually through, whether it's CLIL or EMI, most students are going to need some kind of language teaching support to help them along their way. And so some of this could be related to focusing on improving academic literacy of students planning to enter university. So teaching them not just general English, but academic English. Place more emphasis on productive skills, as well as academic language and specific vocabulary. Vocabulary is, probably one of the biggest areas students struggle with. At university especially, we might need to adapt language support based on students' backgrounds. So maybe those coming from an English medium background or another language medium high school might need more support than those coming from other areas. And we might also need to make accommodations in teaching for students studying in their second language. So we might, in our curriculum, need to make resources more available, slides, reading materials more widely available to students in advance to really support their learning, for example. So those are some final thoughts about teaching English in the 21st century and teaching in English in the 21st century. I'd just like to thank you all for your time, and we might have 5 minutes at the end for questions if we have them, but I'll hand back over to my host.
Hello, and thank you for joining us, and thank you, Professor Rose, for the presentation. And I think now the floor is open. We can accept some questions from the audience. We have hundreds of people, literally, and I'm sure they will be vying to ask questions, Professor Rose. But maybe I should just start by saying thank you. And it's great to actually hear from you, and we explore notions such as global English, globalization, and English teaching and learning. These are all very valuable and important questions. But maybe a question from me to start with, Professor Rose. How would you see technology as a disruptive force in the spread and the learning of English in the future on a global scale?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, actually, because I think it can be quite facilitative. That I think we think of English as a lingua franca, being this language that people from different regions or countries might use to communicate. And I think technology has actually brought those communities closer. And actually, I probably accidentally skipped one slide where I wanted to talk about. There was an interesting study done in Italy with school teachers, and I think Italy, Poland, and one other country. Sorry, I can't remember. It might have been Hungary, where they used technology actually to facilitate real language practice tasks for students in schools in Italy, Poland, and Hungary. And the students had to get together, and they formed groups across the three countries. Via social media and via Zoom and other media to do international projects together where English was the lingua franca for that project. And through that, students got to not only encounter speakers from other languages, but kind of develop naturally strategies to use to communicate. And so I think that's a great example of where a teacher has used technology to the advantage that, it's now much easier than before to bring students together from other countries. And I think that's quite a powerful resource.
That's great to hear, and thank you. And we continue to encourage questions from the floor, so please feel free to just hit and submit your questions. And meanwhile, I think some of us may want to also hear about your global experience, since you have taught in various schools in around the world, and maybe when you're comparing, from your experience, if you compare what you got out from your teaching experience in Asia versus maybe Australia versus Europe, and how would you see this? How would you compare students in these various regions in terms of their, and how would you compare the systems of teaching English in those local regions?
Yeah, I think, that's an interesting question, because I mainly taught English in Australia and to international students in Australia and in Japan. They were, I was in Japan for 11 years teaching in various parts of the education system. And so actually a lot of the work that I've done in global Englishes with activities in the classroom was done in Japan. And Japan is often considered one of those countries that is quite attached to a standard English. In the case of Japan, American English is seen as standard English. And so originally we thought that we might get some resistance to introducing innovations in the curriculum because we know that the students desire, to learn standard American English. But actually we have found that when we talk to students directly about how they're going to use English in the future, that they can be quite open to change. And even though in Japan, a lot of the students in our classes still desired to learn American English, they were quite willing and quite open to interacting and, being exposed to other varieties. And so I think that's quite an interesting example where even students in a context that are quite attached to a standard can be quite open to new ideas about language teaching. When I was teaching in Australia, it was probably quite different because those students, I was mainly teaching English for academic purposes, and those students were entering the University of Sydney. And so I think this is where the needs of the students are important. So for those students, actually a standard written language, written academic English was most important to them. And so I think that's a good example that teachers need to make decisions based on the immediate needs of the students. And they might be different depending on the context and how students are going to use the language in the future.
Thank you. And we now have a question coming in from a member of the audience. I'll read the entire message here. And he or she said, "Thank you very much for the brilliant presentation. My question is, what are the impacts of global English on assessment and testing, such as IELTS?"
Yeah, I can say honestly, the impact at the moment is very little, but we are seeing some change. So we are seeing tests such as IELTS start to introduce different accents in the listening part. And I think, and that's in response to kind of calls from test takers saying that, often the types of English that's being tested on those tests might not be representative of the kind of English that they're going to encounter in the real world. And tests are supposed to be reflections of a person's proficiency in the real world. And so we have seen some changes, particularly in the listening components of those tests. But I think in terms of some of the other components, I think this kind of standard language still prevails. So I think slowly but surely we're seeing some change. But I know that other tests such as TOEFL and IELTS recently have been really engaged in looking at ways to improve their tests and making them more reflective of real world English usage. So I think, the test developers are, open to change, but I think that change will happen quite slowly, if I'm to be honest.
And thank you, Professor. And now that time is upon us, we do have time for one more question, and here it goes from a member of the audience. What advice do you have on teaching global English for younger learners, especially in terms of evaluation? It could be quite difficult.
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and it's actually one that I struggle with because I have my own opinion about this, being that it really depends on the learner. And I think often when we're getting very younger learners involved, I think that often they're still learning the basics of the language. They're learning the basic grammar, the basic building blocks of the language. And so one might argue that it might be too early to be introducing, different varieties of English and different types of English from that, because they might not even be at the stage that they can even notice a difference. And so I've always been of the opinion that a lot of global English innovation maybe would happen more at the intermediate and advanced level, where we know students are perhaps going to go on to become global users of English, that they're not just learning the basics or building blocks. But I do have some colleagues that would argue that actually we should start exposing students to different varieties of English from the very beginning. And so at the moment, actually, we don't have enough evidence to really answer the question of when, at what stage should this happen. But I can say personally, I've mainly introduced it at that intermediate and advanced stage.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Professor. I'm afraid that we have to wrap up here, and also like to extend a thanks to the audience who are giving us so enthusiastic responses. And lastly, may I remind the audience that you are able to download our e-certificate from the website after this webinar, and we'll also be sending you a post-webinar survey. We'd love to get your feedback and comments. We look forward to hearing from you. And once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the professor as well for joining us all the way from so far away, and we look forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you and goodbye.